Hello. Welcome to Mike's Eastern Cape, Land, Law, and People. I've always been fascinated by the interaction between the environment and people and their effect on each other. If you look at this map of the Eastern Cape, South Africa, you'll see that it falls very clearly into two halves. The western half is white, owned, commercial, freehold farms. The eastern half is almost all communal land. Land has always been a deep emotional connection for people all over the world. It's not just soil and rock. And the use of land is controlled by law all over the world. Law, regulations, which determine what you can do where. So we have Acts of Parliament by the King's Most Excellent Majesty, 1937. We have different forms of tenure all over the Eastern Cape. We have three forms of tenure on communal land. We have permission to occupy, or PTOs. We have quit rent, a very old form of tenure. And we have customary tenure allocated by traditional leaders. That tenure differs from one part of the province to the other under very old proclamations like 174 of 1921. We have a more recent law which protects land right holders, but it's an interim act which has to be renewed every year. We have the Constitutional Court making judgments, slowly incorporating customary law into our South African legal system, which is based on Roman Dutch law, and then overlaid by English common law, and now overlaid further to make it quite unique with customary law. Some of the law is well implemented. Some of it is like these land registers, which record 17,000 households' land rights in one district. And you can see them here carefully stored in the agricultural garage just over the petrol cans. The people themselves, listening carefully, very aware, rural, conservative, and they know what's going on. Today, I want to have a look particularly at the invisible people, the Khoi. They were pastoralists, herders, stock keepers. That's the first reason why they are invisible, because they left very little archaeological evidence on the landscape. Secondly, they were incorporated into the Xhosa people as the two peoples met, moving in opposite directions and sharing the same landscape. Thirdly, under apartheid, Khoi people were lumped into that horrible title, coloreds, which covers all sorts of people. And in that sense, they became invisible as well. So the Khoi were stock keepers. They had sheep, they had cattle. They particularly had trained oxen. They had war oxen, riding oxen, racing oxen. And the racing oxen is a custom which the Xhosa people took up until relatively recently, when it was replaced by horse racing. So the Khoi were pastoralists from a very long time back. Certainly in our part of the world, in the Eastern Cape, they were here by round about 2000 before present. They moved southwards from the northern parts of Botswana through the drier west of the continent, southwards directly across the Gariep or Orange River, and then they split west and east. They had sheep by 2,500 years ago. They had cattle sometime after that. They had trade in copper and dacha. They were organized in larger groups or tribes with recognized chiefs or captains. But as they moved eastward, they met the Bantu peoples, eventually Xhosa farmers coming in the opposite direction. What other evidence do we have? If there's no archaeological evidence, or very little, then we're particularly dependent on linguistics, which can track to some extent what happened to them as well. Thousands of years back, the Proto-Khoi language included, for example, a word ku, sheep, which is still incorporated today into Xhosa, Igosha. And that is the only Bantu language that includes that word, which points to the link, the absorption between Khoi and Xhosa. By about 2000 before present, at least, the Khoi had moved southwards across the Kharib and split east and west. And words like gomo and komo, a cow, is common in this part of the world now, adapted from Khoi. By about 1000 before present, the Gonaqua people of the Eastern Cape could no longer understand, if they had met, people from the Western Cape. The two had diverged by at least 1000 years. And in Khoi, there are numerous words relating to water, which is understandable. If you are a pastoralist people in a dry climate, then water is the critical life-giving factor. Some years back, in the 1980s, a friend of mine, Jim Feely, was doing his archaeological research in Transkei, and in the process noted that the river names in the Transkei, in many cases, are Khoi names. They are not Xhosa, they are actually Khoi names. Jim mapped those, as on this map, where there are about 25 or 30 rivers clearly with Khoi names. When I looked at the map, what struck me about it was that that distribution of the rivers coincided with the distribution of districts dominated by sheep as livestock. And that seemed to make sense, that if the Khoi were pastoralists, they moved through the grasslands of Transkei, and the two there coincided. At the same time, it seemed that they avoided the early Iron Age sites occupied by early Iron Age Bantu people, which Jim had identified. And it seems, therefore, that at one stage, the Khoi reached as far as the Kenecha or the Matatiele area towards the present KwaZulu-Natal border. But they were then pushed back and absorbed into the Xhosa people. So that by the time Barrow put together his map in about 1801, a map covered with all sorts of comments, some of them accurate and some of them a bit imaginary. But he, for example, identified the area of Victoria East, Fort Beaufort, Alice, once inhabited by the Gonaqua, a people now extinct. Well, he was wrong about them being extinct by that stage, but certainly they were being incorporated and absorbed into the Xhosa people. The area behind the Amatolas, he pointed out, was deserted on account of the Bushmen. At the coast, the country of a migrant tribe now dwelling in the Seerveld. And that was actually the Amaquaquebe, who had absorbed the Gonaqua into their society. There is some archaeological evidence in our area. Robin Dericourt from the University of Fort Hare in the 1970s excavated at Middeldrift pottery, which was clearly not Xhosa pottery, cattle burials and human burials. Now, those are not customs which the Xhosa people have. Certainly not cattle burials. And those that evidence spreads over a period from about 1000 to about 1750 AD. So the Ganakwa people were recorded to some extent. There are some drawings and paintings. And they are recorded in literature as well as being incorporated into the Amakwebe, who were recognized by King Chiwa around about 1715, after they saved him from being killed and hid him at the Alexandra forest. Noel Mostert, in that marvelous book, Frontiers, also mentions the Amakwebe. By the 1830s, they occupied most of the coastal area from the Chilamna to the Kwelecha rivers under their chief Pato. And we see, if we map it, the maximum easterly expansion of the Khoi sometime in the period 500 to 1500 or so AD, before they met Xhosa people coming southwards. In 1830, the Cape government settled at Cat River a group of Khoi people in place of Chief Nkrumah and his people, who had been pushed out by government. Along the coast, we still find to this day the Amakwebe people with their chiefs Pato and at Middle Drift Chief Kama. But the Khoi were not always invisible. If we look at the Cape population census of 1891, it identifies each ethnic group of people: Malays, Hottentots, in other words, the Khoi, Fingo, Xhosa, mixed, and so on. And if we look at them more carefully for the parts of what is now, we call now Transkei, then we see that in Griqualand East, for example, there were 286 Khoi. In Timberland, there were 582. In Transkei, in other words, the Kaleka part of Transkei, there were 185. And just for interest, you can see that in Timberland, there were 2 Malay people. So the Khoi people, both in the past and in the present, are still there and are becoming more visible in the political landscape now, becoming recognized by the present government. So I hope that now you will no longer think of the Khoi as invisible people, but as some of the indigenous people, the first inhabitants of this part of the world. The next time on Mike's Eastern Cape, I'm going to take a look at the Transkei agriculture myth. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you and goodbye.